The air in the Formosa Strait hung thick and humid on the night of October 24, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane stood on the bridge of the USS Tang, his eyes scanning the moonlit waters ahead. The submarine's diesels throbbed beneath his feet, driving the 311-foot boat forward at 17 knots, her bow cutting a phosphorescent wake through the darkness. In the distance, silhouetted against the horizon, a Japanese convoy steamed southward, oblivious to the predator in their midst. O'Kane raised his binoculars. 3 tankers, a transport, a freighter, and at least 7 escorts, a fat target. His crew had been at war for 9 months, and in that impossibly brief span, they had become the most lethal submarine in the United States Navy. 33 Japanese ships sent to the bottom. Over 116,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, numbers that would never be equaled. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the Tang would fire her last torpedo. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how one submarine achieved what no other American boat ever would, you must first understand the man who commanded her, and the tactical philosophy that made him both brilliant and dangerous. Richard Hetherington O'Kane was born in Dover, New Hampshire, on February 2, 1911. He graduated from the Naval Academy in May of 1934, a serious young officer with a calculating mind and an aggressive temperament that would serve him well in the brutal arithmetic of submarine warfare. O'Kane learned his craft aboard the USS Wahoo under the legendary commander Dudley Morton, a maverick who broke every conventional rule of submarine tactics. Morton did something radical, something that violated the established doctrine of the silent service. He reversed the standard operating procedure. Instead of the captain manning the periscope while the executive officer plotted targets, Morton handled the tactical calculations himself, while O'Kane controlled the periscope. This unconventional arrangement allowed O'Kane to develop an almost supernatural ability to assess targets, calculate ranges, and identify weaknesses in enemy formations, all while Morton orchestrated the attack with the precision of a chess master. Together, they pioneered tactics that other submarine commanders considered suicidal. They ran on the surface in daylight within sight of Japanese airfields. They penetrated harbors that were supposed to be impenetrable. They attacked from ranges so close that lookouts aboard Japanese ships could see the torpedo wakes, and sometimes even the conning tower of the attacking submarine. The Wahoo sank ship after ship using these methods, and O'Kane absorbed every lesson. But Morton pushed too far. On October 11, 1943, the Wahoo was caught in the La Perouse Strait by Japanese aircraft and destroyed with all hands. O'Kane never knew his mentor had died until weeks later. By then, he was already preparing to take command of his own boat, a brand-new Balao-class submarine being built at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. The contract for the USS Tang had been awarded on December 15, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. Her keel was laid down on January 15, 1943, and she was launched on August 17 of that same year. O'Kane took command on October 15, 1943, exactly 4 days after the Wahoo went down. The Tang was no ordinary submarine. She was part of the new Balao class, designed to dive deeper than any previous American submarine. Her pressure hull was constructed from steel plating, twice as thick as earlier boats. The external frames that supported her looked like bridge girders, massive T-beams welded to withstand crushing pressure at depths that would collapse older submarines like tin cans. She could dive to 660 feet, giving her a tactical advantage in escaping depth charge attacks. She measured 311 feet, 10 inches in length, with a beam of 27 feet 4 inches, displacing 1,470 tons on the surface and 2,040 tons submerged. But what made the Tang truly formidable was not her construction. It was her crew, hand-picked by O'Kane from experienced submariners, who understood that survival in the Pacific War required not just courage, but a willingness to embrace tactics that other commanders rejected as too dangerous. O'Kane drilled them relentlessly. He instituted daylight surface cruising with extra lookouts, a practice that seemed to invite attack but actually improved their ability to spot targets. He ran periscope recognition drills until his crew could identify Japanese ship types in seconds, a skill that proved crucial when fractions of a minute determined success or failure. And he taught them his favorite technique, the one he had perfected under Morton, the tactic that would define the Tang's war patrols and ultimately lead to her greatest triumphs and her tragic end. Night surface attacks. Most submarine commanders preferred to attack submerged, using the periscope to line up shots from a safe distance. It was cautious, it was prudent, it minimized risk, but it also limited effectiveness. A submerged submarine moved slowly, had a restricted field of vision, and could only fire torpedoes from the bow or stern tubes in carefully calculated spreads. If the target maneuvered unexpectedly, there was little a submerged boat could do to adjust. O'Kane rejected this doctrine entirely. He attacked on the surface, at night, using the Tang's diesel engines to achieve speeds of over 20 knots. This gave him maneuverability that submerged boats could never match. He could dart in, fire from point-blank range, and maneuver away before the escorts even realized what was happening. The Tang's low profile made her almost invisible in darkness, and O'Kane exploited this ruthlessly. But he went further. He developed a tactic that other submarine commanders considered not just risky, but insane. He would penetrate into the center of enemy convoys, positioning the Tang among the very ships he intended to destroy. This violated every principle of submarine warfare. It meant the Tang would be surrounded by targets, yes, but also surrounded by escorts. One mistake, one moment of bad luck, and the submarine would be trapped with nowhere to run. O'Kane didn't care. He understood something that more cautious commanders missed. In the chaos of a night attack, with ships exploding and escorts racing to respond, no one expected the attacker to be in the middle of the formation. The escorts would search the perimeter, dropping depth charges in the open water where they assumed the submarine must be. Meanwhile, the Tang would be drifting among the merchant ships themselves, using their hulls as cover, firing torpedoes at targets so close that the crew could see individual sailors on deck. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it worked with devastating efficiency. The Tang arrived at Pearl Harbor on January 8, 1944, and conducted 2 weeks of final exercises before departing on her first war patrol on January 22. She was assigned to the Caroline Islands and Mariana Islands area, waters heavily patrolled by Japanese forces. O'Kane took her into harm's way immediately. On the morning of February 17th, lookouts spotted a convoy, 2 freighters, 5 smaller vessels, and their escorts. Standard procedure called for a cautious approach, a carefully plotted attack from distance. O'Kane closed to less than 1,500 yards and fired 4 torpedoes at the lead ship, the Fukuyama Maru. All 4 hit, the first striking the bow, the second and third amidships, the fourth at the stern. The freighter disintegrated in a series of explosions so violent that flaming wreckage shot hundreds of feet into the air. The escorts charged toward the last known position of the Tang, dropping depth charges in a pattern that would have destroyed a conventionally positioned submarine. But O'Kane had already maneuvered the Tang directly alongside another cargo ship, using it as a shield. When the depth charges stopped, he surfaced briefly, fired again, and sent the Yamashimo Maru to the bottom before diving and escaping the area. By the end of the first patrol, the Tang had expended all 24 of her torpedoes and sunk 5 ships, totaling more than 18,000 tons. 16 of the 24 torpedoes had hit their targets, a success rate that was almost unheard of in the early war period when American torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. The second patrol, beginning March 16, 1944, took the Tang to the Palau Islands, Davao Gulf, and the approaches to Truk. She made 5 surface contacts, but found no opportunities to attack. Instead, O'Kane was assigned to lifeguard duty, a joint operation where submarines positioned themselves off enemy-held islands during carrier airstrikes to rescue downed American pilots. On April 30th and May 1st, During the massive carrier raids on Truk, the Tang rescued 22 airmen, including some who had been picked up by a Vought Kingfisher float plane that couldn't take off with the extra weight. The Tang surfaced inside Truk Lagoon under Japanese guns and took the men aboard before escaping. For this action, she received a Presidential Unit citation. But it was the third patrol that established the Tang's legend and revealed the full scope of what O'Kane's tactics could achieve. On June 8th, the Tang departed Pearl Harbor for the East China Sea and Yellow Sea, some of the most heavily defended waters in the Japanese Empire. These were not the open expanses of the Pacific, where a submarine could hide in deep water. These were shallow, confined seas, thick with enemy patrol craft, minefields, and air patrols. Conventional wisdom held that American submarines should avoid these areas, except for brief incursions. O'Kane intended to hunt there for weeks. He positioned the Tang in the shipping lanes between China and Japan, where convoys moved in a steady stream, and he attacked with a ferocity that stunned even his own crew. On June 24th, in a single day, the Tang sank 4 ships. The Tamahoko Maru, Tainan Maru, Nasusan Maru, and Kenichi Maru all went down in rapid succession. O'Kane had found a large convoy and executed a textbook version of his penetration tactic, putting the Tang in the center of the formation and firing in all directions. But what the crew didn't know, what O'Kane didn't know, was that the Tamahoko Maru was carrying Allied prisoners of war. 565 men drowned when the ship went down, 195 of them Australians. It was the unspoken tragedy of submarine warfare. There was no way to know what cargo a ship carried until it was already destroyed. By the end of the third patrol, the Tang had sunk 10 ships, totaling 39,160 tons. It was the most successful single patrol by any American submarine in the entire war, a record that would never be broken. O'Kane had fired 6 torpedoes at what he thought were 2 ships. Japanese records later showed he had actually hit 4 vessels. The torpedoes had punched through the formation with such precision that they'd struck targets he hadn't even been aiming at. The fourth patrol, from July 31st to September 3rd, 1944, took the Tang into Japanese home waters off the coast of Honshu. This was the beating heart of the enemy's merchant fleet, the final destination for convoys carrying oil, rubber, iron, and all the raw materials that kept Japan's war machine functioning. It was also the most heavily defended area in the Pacific, ringed with destroyers, patrol craft, aircraft, and mines. O'Kane didn't hesitate. On August 10th, the Tang attacked a tanker near Omeyazaki but missed. 2 days later, O'Kane redeemed the error by sinking the Roko Maru. On August 14th, the Tang attacked a patrol yacht with her deck gun, reducing the Japanese vessel to wreckage with 8 direct hits. 8 days later, she sank a 225-foot patrol boat. On August 23rd, lookouts spotted a large transport with Japanese crew members in white uniforms lining the superstructure and bridge, clearly visible even at distance. O'Kane fired 3 torpedoes. 2 hit, and the Tsukushi Maru, displacing 8,135 tons, sank rapidly. 2 days later, the Tang used her last 3 torpedoes to sink a tanker and an escort. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By September, when the Tang returned to Pearl Harbor, she had become the most feared American submarine in the Pacific. Her reputation preceded her. Other submarine crews talked about O'Kane's tactics with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Some called him a genius, others called him reckless. O'Kane called himself a realist. He understood that in submarine warfare, caution was often just another word for ineffectiveness. But there was a deeper truth to O'Kane's methods, something that went beyond tactical innovation. Every time the Tang surfaced in the middle of an enemy convoy, every time O'Kane ordered his boat into positions where a single mistake would mean certain death, he was making a calculated bet. He was betting that aggression, speed, and surprise could overcome numerical superiority. He was betting that Japanese escorts would follow their doctrine, would search in the wrong places, would make the assumptions, that conventional tactics encouraged, and he was betting that his crew had the skill and nerve to execute maneuvers that would give other submariners nightmares. Most of the time, he won those bets. But probability is a harsh master, and in warfare, even the most skilled eventually encounter the one scenario they cannot overcome. After a brief refit, the Tang stood out to sea on September 24, 1944, for her fifth war patrol. O'Kane had requested assignment to the Formosa Strait, the narrow waters between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. It was one of the most dangerous patrol areas in the Pacific, heavily defended, thick with mines, and subject to frequent air patrols. Most submarine commanders tried to avoid it. O'Kane sailed directly into it. The Tang topped off her fuel at Midway on September 27th and headed west. To reach the patrol area, she had to pass through waters known to be mined and patrolled by Japanese forces, specifically hunting for American submarines. O'Kane could have joined a coordinated attack group with the USS Silversides, USS Trigger, and USS Salmon, making the passage with mutual support. He chose to go alone. On the night of October 10th and 11th, the Tang sank two cargo ships, the Joshugo and the Oitamaru. O'Kane was working his way through the shipping lanes, picking off targets with the methodical efficiency that had defined all of the Tang's patrols. But he was also expending torpedoes rapidly, and he knew that once they were gone, the patrol would end. By October 23rd, the Tang had 2 torpedoes remaining. That night, lookouts spotted what O'Kane had been hunting for: a large convoy, southbound, heading for Leyte Gulf, where American forces had just launched the Philippines invasion. 3 tankers, a transport, a freighter, and numerous escorts. It was exactly the kind of target that justified every risk O'Kane had taken, every dangerous maneuver he had executed. This was the moment that defined everything. This was why the Tang had come to the Formosa Strait. O'Kane could have shadowed the convoy, radioed its position to other American submarines, and let them handle the attack. He could have fired his last 2 torpedoes from distance and retreated. Instead, he ordered a night surface attack. He brought the Tang to full speed and drove directly into the center of the convoy. The Tang broke through the screen of escorts, and suddenly she was among the merchant ships themselves, surrounded by targets, her crew loading torpedoes as fast as the mechanisms would allow. O'Kane fired at the nearest tanker. 2 torpedoes struck under the stack and engine room. He fired at the middle tanker. A single torpedo slammed into the stern. He fired at the farthest tanker. 2 more torpedoes exploded under the stack and engine space. The first torpedoes began detonating before the last ones were even fired. Ships erupted in flames. Explosions lit the night sky. Burning oil spread across the water. And in the midst of this chaos, the Tang maneuvered at high speed, avoiding collisions, dodging escorts, firing again and again. Then O'Kane saw the transport bearing down on the Tang, attempting to ram. At the same instant, one of the tankers, also trying to ram, was on a collision course from a different angle. The Tang was trapped between 2 ships, each displacing thousands of tons, each trying to crush the submarine. O'Kane threw the Tang into a hard turn. The 2 Japanese ships, unable to maneuver as quickly, collided with each other in a grinding crash of steel. The Tang slipped between them and fired 4 stern torpedoes as she cleared the wreckage. Both ships began to sink. In less than 20 minutes, the Tang had sent multiple ships to the bottom and thrown an entire convoy into disarray. It was O'Kane's masterpiece, the perfect execution of everything he had learned from Morton, everything he had developed over 9 months of combat. The Tang had 2 torpedoes left. O'Kane swept the horizon with his binoculars. The convoy was in shambles, ships burned, escorts raced in circles, dropping depth charges on phantom contacts. Survivors clung to wreckage in oil-slicked water. But one ship remained, a transport that had somehow avoided the carnage. It was damaged, listing, but still afloat. O'Kane made a decision. He would finish it. The Tang had been at sea for 28 days. The crew was exhausted. They had fired 22 torpedoes in multiple attacks. sinking ship after ship with the relentless efficiency that had made them legends. By the official count that would emerge later, the Tang had destroyed 13 vessels on this patrol alone, more than 107,000 tons of enemy shipping. It was an unprecedented accomplishment, the most successful single patrol in the history of submarine warfare. But O'Kane wanted that last ship. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on October 25, 1944, the Tang maneuvered into position for a final attack. The transport was moving slowly, clearly damaged from the earlier engagement. O'Kane ordered the last 2 torpedoes loaded into the forward tubes. The crew worked in near silence, the only sounds the mechanical clanking of the loading mechanism and the throb of the diesel engines. The first torpedo was a Mark 18, an electric torpedo that ran without leaving a visible wake. It was more reliable than the earlier Mark 14 models that had plagued American submarines in the first years of the war, but it still had flaws. The gyroscope that controlled its direction could malfunction, the depth-keeping mechanism could fail, and in rare cases, the steering mechanism could jam, causing the torpedo to run in a circle. O'Kane gave the firing order. The first torpedo launched cleanly and ran straight toward the transport. Through his binoculars, O'Kane watched it track true. It was going to hit. Then he ordered the second torpedo. Fired. The torpedo left the tube normally. For a few seconds, it appeared to be running straight. Then something went wrong. The torpedo broached, breaking the surface of the water. Its steering mechanism had jammed or malfunctioned. Instead of continuing toward the target, it began to turn. First a slight curve, then a tighter arc, then a full circle. It was coming back. On the bridge, someone shouted a warning. O'Kane saw it immediately. The torpedo was running on the surface, its wake visible in the moonlight, and it was heading directly at the Tang. O'Kane ordered emergency maneuvers. The helmsman threw the Tang into a hard turn, trying to swing the 311-foot submarine out of the path of the oncoming torpedo. The diesels roared to full power. The Tang began to swing, her stern sliding sideways, her bow cutting through the water. But submarines don't turn quickly. They're not built for rapid maneuvers. The Tang was moving, yes, but the torpedo was moving faster, 20 seconds. That's all the time they had from the moment the torpedo began its circular run to the moment of impact. 20 seconds to turn a 2,000-ton submarine out of the path of an object that was designed specifically to destroy submarines. They almost made it. The torpedo struck the Tang on the port side, near the aft torpedo room. The explosion was catastrophic. The warhead, carrying over 600 pounds of Torpex high explosive, detonated against the pressure hull with devastating force. The torpedo room was obliterated instantly. Half of the 87 men aboard the Tang died in that first second, either killed by the blast or drowned as water flooded into the ruptured compartments. The explosion threw O'Kane and several other men from the bridge into the water. The Tang, fatally damaged, began to sink immediately. Her bow tilted upward as the stern flooded, and then she slid backward into the Formosa Strait. Within moments, she settled on the bottom at a depth of 180 feet. Inside the submarine, in the forward compartments that remained intact, the surviving crew members faced a nightmare scenario. The Tang was on the bottom. The air was already growing foul. Depth charges from the convoy escorts were exploding in the water above them, each detonation a hammer blow against the hull. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they were going to die unless they could escape. The forward torpedo room and the forward battery compartment were still dry. 13 men gathered there, led by some of O'Kane's most experienced crew. They had one chance. The Momsen lung had been standard equipment on American submarines since the 1930s, but it had never been successfully used in an actual sinking. It was a simple device, a rubber breathing bag with a mouthpiece and a canister of soda lime to absorb carbon dioxide. The theory was straightforward. A sailor would enter the escape trunk, a small chamber, about the size of a phone booth. The chamber would be flooded with seawater, equalizing the pressure with the ocean outside. Then the sailor would open the outer hatch, put the Momsen lung mouthpiece in place, and ascend to the surface using the buoyancy of the device and the air trapped in the breathing bag. In practice, it was terrifyingly difficult. At 180 feet, the water pressure was over 80 pounds per square inch. The ascent had to be controlled. If a sailor rose too quickly, the expanding air in his lungs could rupture them. If he rose too slowly, the limited air in the Momsen lung would run out. And the entire time, he would be in near total darkness, alone, hoping that the breathing device would function and that he would emerge somewhere near the surface before losing consciousness. The crew rigged the escape trunk and began the process. 4 men could squeeze into the chamber at once. They put on the Momsen lungs, checked the seals, and waited while the chamber flooded. When the pressure equalized, they opened the outer hatch and released a wooden buoy with a lanyard attached. The buoy would rise to the surface, and the men would follow it up, using the lanyard as a guide. One by one, groups of men entered the escape trunk. One by one, they flooded the chamber, opened the hatch, and began their ascent through 180 feet of cold, dark water. Some made it, others didn't. The Momsen lung required precise breathing control. Too much exhalation, and the bag would empty. Too much inhalation, and the expanding air would damage the lungs. In the stress of the moment, with adrenaline flooding their systems and the certainty of death driving them upward, some men breathed incorrectly. 13 men attempted the escape. 8 reached the surface alive. On the bridge, when the torpedo struck, O'Kane and 3 other men had been blown into the water by the force of the explosion. They surfaced almost immediately, shocked but alive. For several hours, they clung to debris in the darkness, watching as the convoy escorts searched for survivors from the ships the Tang had sunk. As dawn broke on October 25th, the men who had used the Momsen lungs began reaching the surface. They emerged one at a time, gasping, disoriented, some injured from the pressure changes. O'Kane watched them surface and called out, trying to gather them together. But one man, weakened by the ascent, drowned before anyone could reach him. Another 5 had died during the escape, their bodies remaining in the sunken submarine. 9 men survived, 9 out of 87. They floated in the water, exhausted, as the sun rose. And then they saw a Japanese destroyer escort approaching. It was the P-34, the same vessel that was picking up survivors from the Japanese ships the Tang had sunk the night before. The irony was brutal. On the deck of the P-34 were burned and wounded Japanese sailors who had survived the Tang's attacks. They had watched their shipmates die. They had endured explosions, fires, and drownings caused directly by the men now being pulled from the water. When the Tang survivors were brought aboard, the Japanese sailors descended on them with fists, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. O'Kane later wrote about this with remarkable restraint. He understood, he said, that the beatings were being administered by the survivors of the Tang's own attacks. Under those circumstances, he could take it with less prejudice. It was a measure of the man, that even in that moment, he could see the situation from his enemy's perspective. The 9 survivors were taken to Ofuna, a special Japanese detention center for high-value prisoners. Because the Japanese government considered submarine attacks on merchant vessels to be war crimes, the Tang survivors were not treated as conventional prisoners of war. They were held in secret, interrogated, and subjected to treatment that violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions. O'Kane refused to break. He gave the Japanese only his name, rank, and serial number. He endured beatings, starvation rations, and months of isolation. Eventually, he and the other survivors were transferred to Omori, a regular POW camp, where conditions improved marginally. They spent the remainder of the war in captivity, not knowing whether anyone in the United States knew they were alive or what had happened to the Tang. The Navy had no information. The Tang simply disappeared from contact after departing Midway, and for months she was listed as missing and presumed lost. On October 6, 1944, the Navy issued a press release confirming that the Tang had been sunk, but they didn't know how. They didn't know about the circular running torpedo. They didn't know there were survivors. The Tang was simply gone, the 37th American submarine lost in the Pacific War. It wasn't until May of 1945, after the war in Europe had ended but, while fighting continued in the Pacific, that O'Kane and his crew were liberated from the POW camps. Only then did the full story emerge. O'Kane provided detailed reports of the Tang's final patrol, describing the attacks, the ships sunk, and the catastrophic malfunction of the final torpedo. The numbers were staggering. In 5 war patrols spanning just 9 months of active combat, the Tang had sunk 33 Japanese ships, totaling 116,454 tons. She had damaged 2 others. She held the record for the most ships sunk in a single day. She held the record for the most successful patrol in terms of ships destroyed. And her commanding officer, Richard O'Kane, had participated in more successful attacks on Japanese shipping than any other submarine officer in the war, counting both his time on the Wahoo and his command of the Tang. On March 27, 1946, President Harry Truman presented O'Kane with the Medal of Honor in ceremonies on the White House lawn. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Tang, operating against 2 enemy Japanese convoys on October 23 and October 24, 1944, during her 5th and last war patrol." O'Kane also received 3 Navy Crosses and 3 Silver Stars. The Tang received 4 Battle Stars and 2 Presidential Unit Citations. Of the 263 American submarines that served in World War II, only one other boat, the USS Flasher, received 2 Presidential Unit Citations. But the story of the Tang is not simply a story of success. It's a story about the nature of submarine warfare itself and the terrible calculus that governs it. Submarine combat in World War II was unlike any other form of warfare. Surface ships fought in formations, with mutual support. Aircraft operated in groups, with wingmen providing cover. Infantry advanced with supporting units on their flanks, but submarines operated alone, often hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly vessel. A submarine commander made decisions in isolation, knowing that no help would arrive if something went wrong. This created a unique psychological pressure. Caution meant survival, but it also meant ineffectiveness. Aggressive tactics meant success, but they also exponentially increased risk. Every submarine commander had to find his own balance point between these extremes. O'Kane chose maximum aggression. He developed tactics that deliberately placed his submarine in the most dangerous possible positions because those positions also offered the best opportunities to inflict damage. He surfaced when doctrine said to remain submerged. He closed to ranges where other commanders feared to go. He penetrated convoy centers where escorts could attack from any direction. This approach worked spectacularly well, until it didn't. The final irony of the Tang's story is this. She was not sunk by superior Japanese tactics. She was not sunk by a well-placed depth charge or a skilled escort commander. She was sunk by her own weapon, a torpedo that malfunctioned in a way that was rare but not unknown. The Mark 18 electric torpedo had a circular run rate of approximately 1 in every 500 launches. The Tang had fired 24 torpedoes on her final patrol. The odds finally caught up. If that last torpedo had run straight, if it had hit the transport as intended, the Tang would have completed her patrol and returned to Pearl Harbor. O'Kane would have gone on to command other submarines. The crew would have survived. The Tang's legend would have been one of unqualified success rather than tragic brilliance. But submarine warfare doesn't offer second chances. One malfunction, one moment of mechanical failure, and 78 men died. The Tang's wreck remained on the bottom of the Formosa Strait, 180 feet below the surface, a steel tomb containing the bodies of men who had been among the best submarine sailors in the world. For decades, the wreck was undisturbed, marked on maritime charts as a navigation hazard but otherwise ignored. O'Kane remained in the Navy after the war. He commanded submarine tenders, testified at the Tokyo War Crimes trials, served as commander of Submarine Division 32, and eventually became the commanding officer of the submarine school at New London, Connecticut. He retired as a rear admiral in 1957, having spent 20 years in the submarine service. He wrote 2 books about his experiences. Clear the Bridge, The War Patrols of the USS Tang was published in 1977 and became a classic of naval literature. WWII, The Patrols of America's most famous World War II submarine, followed in 1987, finally telling the full story of his time under Dudley Morton, including the tragic final patrol that had remained classified for decades. O'Kane died on February 16, 1994, 2 weeks after his 83rd birthday. He was buried in Section 59 at Arlington National Cemetery. His widow arranged for a memorial stone to be placed at the grave, listing not just his own decorations but also commemorating the crew of the Tang who died in the Formosa Strait. The legend of the Tang lived on in other ways. When a new submarine was commissioned in 1952, she was given the name USS Tang in honor of the lost boat. That second Tang served until 1980, earning her own battle honors during the Cold War. A third vessel, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, was named USS O'Kane and commissioned in 1997, carrying the Admiral's name and legacy into the 21st century. But perhaps the most unusual tradition associated with O'Kane's memory is the cribbage board. During the war, Morton and O'Kane played cribbage aboard the WWII to relieve tension between attacks. On one occasion, Morton dealt O'Kane a perfect 29-point hand, and that night the WWII sank 2 Japanese freighters. A few days later, Morton dealt O'Kane a 28-point hand, and the WWII sank 3 more ships. The cribbage board became a talisman, a symbol of the partnership between the 2 men. The original board was lost when the Tang went down in 1944, but in 1957, the crew of the second USS Tang presented O'Kane with a replacement cribbage board. After O'Kane's death, the board was given to the wardroom of the oldest fast attack submarine in the United States Pacific Fleet. When that submarine is decommissioned, the board transfers to the next oldest boat, carrying O'Kane's memory through successive generations of submariners. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans created a special interactive exhibit called Final Mission, the USS Tang Submarine Experience. Visitors enter a recreation of the submarine, are assigned to crew positions, and experience a simulation of the events of October 24th and 25th, 1944. The exhibit includes the circular run of the final torpedo and the sinking of the boat, giving modern audiences a glimpse of what the crew experienced in their final moments. So what does the story of the USS Tang tell us? What lessons can be drawn from 9 months of unprecedented success, followed by catastrophic failure? First, it demonstrates that in warfare, there is always a tension between effectiveness and survival. O'Kane's tactics were undeniably effective. No other American submarine achieved what the Tang achieved, but those tactics also required accepting levels of risk that most commanders rejected. O'Kane won that bet repeatedly, until the odds finally turned against him. Second, it shows that technology is never perfectly reliable. American torpedoes in World War II were plagued by malfunctions throughout the conflict. Circular runs, premature detonations, failures to explode on impact, and depth-keeping errors killed American submariners and allowed Japanese ships to escape. The Tang was not the first submarine to be hit by its own torpedo. The USS Tulibi had been sunk by a circular run on March 26, 1944, 7 months before the Tang. Only 1 man from the Tulibi's crew of 80 survived. Third, the Tang's story illustrates the fundamental loneliness of submarine command. When O'Kane made the decision to penetrate that final convoy, when he ordered the last torpedoes fired, he was making choices that would determine whether 87 men lived or died. There was no one to consult, no higher authority to approve the plan. Just O'Kane, his training, his experience, and his judgment. And finally, the story reminds us that in war, the line between heroism and tragedy is often determined by factors beyond anyone's control. If that torpedo had run straight, O'Kane would be remembered simply as the most successful submarine commander in American history. Because it malfunctioned, He is remembered as a brilliant tactician whose aggressive methods ultimately contributed to his own boat's destruction. Both interpretations are true. Both are incomplete. The USS Tang and her crew were neither perfect heroes nor reckless cowboys. They were highly trained professionals who executed a specific tactical doctrine with extraordinary skill and paid the ultimate price when technology failed them at the worst possible moment. They sank more enemy shipping than any other American submarine. They rescued downed pilots under fire. They pioneered tactics that other boats would use for the remainder of the war. And 78 of them died in the dark waters of the Formosa Strait, victims of the very weapon they had used so effectively against the enemy. O'Kane carried that burden for the rest of his life. He had ordered the final torpedo fired. He had chosen the tactics that put the Tang in position for that last attack. He survived when most of his crew did not. Those are heavy weights for any commander to bear. But he also knew something that his critics often missed. In submarine warfare, as in all warfare, there are no perfect choices. There is only the decision you make with the information you have, in the moment you have to make it. O'Kane made his decisions based on 9 months of experience that had proven, again and again, that aggressive tactics worked. The fact that they failed catastrophically on the last day of the last patrol does not invalidate everything that came before. The Tang's story ends in the Formosa Strait, but its legacy lives on in every submarine that bears her name, in every tactical manual that references O'Kane's innovations, and in the memory of 87 men who served aboard the most successful submarine in United States Navy history. They achieved something remarkable. They paid a terrible price. And they deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for what they accomplished in the brief time they had. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.